The porcelain plate crashed against polished oak as 52-year-old Matthew Moore convulsed in his dining chair, blood trickling from his nose while his face contorted in agony that no amount of wealth could prevent. The aroma of roasted quail and sweet potato pie still hung in the air of Thornfield Ranch's grand dining hall, mingling with the acrid scent of something far more sinister. This was the moment when 18 years of brutal oppression crystallized into a single act of vengeance that would shatter the carefully constructed facade of Texas cotton aristocracy. Grace Harris stood motionless against the servant's entrance, her calloused hands folded over her apron, watching the man who had stolen her freedom die with the same stoic expression she had maintained through nearly 2 decades of bondage. She had served this Sunday supper with meticulous care, knowing it would be Matthew Moore's last meal on earth, and that his death would expose secrets that powerful men had worked desperately to keep buried beneath the scorching Texas sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sunday afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dining hall of Thornfield Ranch as Matthew Moore's trembling hands reached for his water goblet, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The crystal glass slipped from his grasp and shattered against the hardwood floor, sending fragments skittering across polished planks that Grace Harris had scrubbed on her hands and knees just that morning. The sound echoed through the cavernous room like the crack of a whip, a noise that had punctuated her existence for 18 years in this god-forsaken corner of eastern Texas, where cotton grew thick and human souls withered under the weight of brutality disguised as civilization. Matthew Moore had built his empire on the broken backs of 47 human beings, who worked his 3,000 acres of prime bottomland along the Brazos River. His ranch house stood as a monument to wealth extracted through violence, a sprawling structure of imported limestone and hand-carved timber that proclaimed his status as one of the most successful planters in Robertson County. The dining hall where he now fought for breath featured walls adorned with oil paintings of racehorses he owned, silver candelabras purchased from New Orleans merchants, and a mahogany table that could seat 20 guests during the elaborate dinners he hosted, to display his prosperity to neighbors and politicians who envied his success. Grace had prepared this particular Sunday supper with the same attention to detail she had applied to every meal during her years of forced service in this house. The roasted quail had been seasoned with herbs from the kitchen garden, basted with butter until the skin turned golden and crisp. The sweet potato pie featured cinnamon and nutmeg imported at considerable expense from merchants in Galveston. The cornbread was still warm from the oven, its surface brushed with honey that caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows draped in burgundy velvet. But the coffee, that dark, aromatic brew that Matthew Moore demanded with every meal, carried something extra today. Something that Grace had been cultivating in secret for the past 9 months, ever since the night she had discovered what this man had done to her sister Hannah, and decided that certain crimes demanded payment that no court of law would ever extract from a white plantation owner in the sovereign state of Texas in the year of our Lord 1852. The poison had come from oleander plants that grew in ornamental profusion around the ranch house perimeter, white and pink blossoms that Matthew Moore's late wife had planted years ago, never imagining that their beauty concealed deadly potential in every leaf, every stem, every drop of sap. Grace had learned the plant's secrets through careful observation and whispered knowledge passed between women who understood that survival sometimes required mastering the properties of growing things that could heal or harm, depending on intention and dosage. She had harvested the leaves during the dark hours before dawn, when the overseer slept off his whiskey and the ranch lay quiet under stars that seemed to mock her bondage with their indifferent brilliance. She had dried them slowly in the back corner of the kitchen where the fireplace heat would do its work without attracting attention from the other house staff, who might ask uncomfortable questions. She had ground them into powder using a mortar and pestle, working late into the night after the household had retired, her hands moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned patience through years of waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The dosage had required careful calculation. Too little and Matthew Moore would merely sicken, perhaps recover, certainly grow suspicious about the source of his illness. Too much and death would come so quickly that doctors might identify poison as the cause, rather than attributing his demise to the heart troubles that had plagued him for the past 3 years. Grace had aimed for the narrow range that would produce symptoms consistent with cardiac failure, making his death seem like the natural conclusion to a medical condition that everyone in Robertson County knew afflicted the man. She had added the powder to his coffee grounds that morning, mixing it thoroughly with the dark roasted beans he preferred, ensuring that every cup poured from the silver service would carry the same deadly concentration. The bitter taste of oleander would be masked by the coffee's natural flavor, and Matthew Moore's habit of drinking 3 cups with his Sunday meal meant he would consume more than enough to achieve the effect Grace intended. Now she watched as those effects manifested with the terrible beauty of a plan executed to perfection. Matthew Moore's face had gone from its normal ruddy complexion to an alarming shade of gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead and soaked through the collar of his fine linen shirt. His breathing came in ragged gasps that suggested his heart was struggling to maintain the rhythm necessary to sustain life. His hands clutched at his chest as if he could physically hold together the organ that was betraying him with every failing beat. Grace maintained her position near the servants' entrance, her expression revealing nothing of the satisfaction that burned in her chest like righteous fire. She had learned long ago to school her features into the mask of submissive neutrality that white people expected from those they enslaved. Her face showed appropriate concern for her master's distress, the worry of a loyal servant witnessing unexpected tragedy, rather than the cold calculation of someone who had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a military campaign. The other house staff would arrive soon, summoned by the sounds of distress that were beginning to echo through the ranch house. She would need to maintain her performance through whatever chaos followed, playing the role of the devoted servant, shocked by her master's sudden collapse, offering assistance that would appear genuine, while ensuring that nothing she did would actually save his life. Matthew Moore slid from his chair and hit the floor with a heavy thud that shook the china in the cabinet against the far wall. His legs kicked spasmodically, heels drumming against hardwood in a rhythm that would have been comical if it weren't the death throes of a man who had wielded absolute power over her existence for nearly 2 decades. His eyes, usually so sharp with the calculating intelligence that had built his fortune, now stared at the ceiling with the unfocused gaze of someone watching their own mortality approach from a distance they could no longer control. Grace counted the seconds, timing his convulsions with the same precision she had applied to every aspect of this carefully planned murder. The oleander would take approximately 15 minutes to complete its work, based on her observations of the ranch's livestock that had accidentally ingested the plant over the years. Matthew Moore was a large man, well-fed and robust despite his heart condition, which meant he might take slightly longer to succumb than the calculation suggested. She could hear footsteps approaching from the kitchen, the rapid pace of someone responding to the unmistakable sounds of medical emergency. The performance was about to begin in earnest, and Grace Harris steeled herself for the most important acting challenge of her life, knowing that her survival depended on convincing everyone who witnessed this scene that she was simply a loyal servant caught in the tragedy of her master's unexpected death, rather than the architect of his carefully planned execution. Grace Harris had arrived at Thornfield Ranch in the spring of 1834, purchased at auction in Houston along with her mother and younger sister Hannah for the sum of $900. She was 8 years old then, small for her age, with hands that would grow calloused from years of labor that began before dawn and ended long after darkness fell across the Texas prairie. Matthew Moore had been building his cotton empire in those days, transforming raw land into productive acreage that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest planters in Robertson County and secure his position among the class of men who shaped territorial politics through their economic influence and willingness to use violence to maintain their advantages. The ranch occupied prime bottomland where the Brazos River deposited rich soil during seasonal floods, creating conditions perfect for the long staple cotton that commanded premium prices in New Orleans and European markets, hungry for raw materials to feed their textile mills. Matthew Moore had recognized the land's potential before most settlers understood how valuable these river valleys would become, purchasing thousands of acres when prices remained low, and labor could be acquired cheaply through the expanding domestic trade that moved human beings like livestock across the American South. Grace's mother had died during a cholera outbreak in 1839, leaving Grace and Hannah to navigate the brutal realities of plantation life without the protection that maternal presence provided. The two sisters had clung to each other through years of backbreaking fieldwork, inadequate food, and the constant threat of violence that hung over their existence like the Texas heat that made summer labor feel like punishment designed by a vengeful deity. Grace had assumed responsibility for Hannah's well-being, taking extra beatings when her younger sister failed to meet the overseer's production quotas, stealing food when rations ran short, and providing the emotional support that kept both of them sane in circumstances designed to break human spirits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Matthew Moore ran Thornfield Ranch according to principles he had learned from his father, who had operated a sugar plantation in Louisiana before yellow fever claimed his life in 1828. Those principles held that enslaved people were property to be managed for maximum economic return, that discipline should be swift and severe to maintain order, and that any sign of resistance must be crushed immediately to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas about freedom or human dignity. The overseer he employed, a man named Eli Barrett, who had drifted west from Alabama after killing a free black man in a dispute over gambling debts, implemented these principles with enthusiasm that bordered on sadism. Barrett carried a braided leather whip that he used with casual frequency, administering punishment for infractions real and imagined. He maintained a system of surveillance that required enslaved people to inform on each other's activities, creating an atmosphere of suspicion that prevented the formation of organized resistance. He controlled access to food, clothing, and basic necessities, ensuring that everyone remained dependent on his goodwill for survival. His presence poisoned the atmosphere of Thornfield Ranch more thoroughly than any oleander extract could poison a single cup of coffee. Grace had been moved into the main house in 1846, selected for domestic service based on her literacy and her ability to follow complex instructions. Matthew Moore's wife had taught her to read using a worn Bible, violating Texas laws that prohibited the education of enslaved people, but justifying the transgression as necessary for Grace to properly manage household accounts and correspondence. The skill had opened new worlds to Grace, exposing her to ideas about liberty and human rights that made her bondage feel even more intolerable than it had when she labored in ignorance under the scorching Texas sun. House service brought privileges that field workers never experienced. Grace slept in a small room off the kitchen, rather than in the cramped quarters, where 20 people shared space designed for half that number. She ate better food, wore cleaner clothes, and avoided the brutal physical labor that broke bodies and shortened lives with grim efficiency. But proximity to the Moore family also meant witnessing their casual cruelty, their thoughtless consumption of luxury built on stolen labor, and their complete inability to recognize the humanity of the people who served their every need. Matthew Moore treated Grace with the same casual condescension he applied to his favorite hunting dog, praising her competence when she performed well and punishing her failures with sharp words and occasional violence that reminded her that his civility extended only as far as his convenience required. He spoke to visitors about his contented workers and the Christian principles that guided his management style, never acknowledging the contradiction between his professed religious faith and his enthusiastic participation in a system that treated human beings as negotiable commodities. His Sunday suppers had become legendary throughout Robertson County, elaborate affairs where he entertained neighbors, politicians, and businessmen with food prepared by Grace, and served with the kind of attention to detail that suggested genuine hospitality rather than performances designed to demonstrate wealth and social status. Grace had served dozens of these meals over the years, standing silently against the wall while white men discussed cotton prices, political developments, and their shared conviction that the institution of bondage represented the natural order of things, rather than a crime against humanity. But the breaking point had come 9 months earlier, on a night when Grace had discovered what Matthew Moore had done to her sister Hannah. She had found Hannah behind the smokehouse after supper, her face swollen from crying, her dress torn, her spirit shattered in ways that no amount of time would fully repair. The story had emerged slowly, painfully, each word extracted like a confession of sins that belonged to someone else entirely. Matthew Moore had been taking Hannah to his study after dark for the past 6 weeks, using her in ways that Grace's mind struggled to process, even as Hannah's halting words painted pictures of violation that no sister should have to hear. The assaults had been systematic, calculated, and accompanied by threats that if Hannah told anyone or resisted his advances, he would sell her to a cotton buyer heading to the brutal plantations of the Mississippi Delta, where life expectancy measured in years rather than decades. Grace had held her sister while Hannah sobbed, feeling rage crystallize into something harder and colder than anything she had experienced during 18 years of bondage. She had understood in that moment that certain crimes demanded payment that no legal system would extract, that justice sometimes required taking matters into her own hands regardless of the consequences, and that she possessed both the intelligence and the access necessary to deliver punishment that courts controlled by men like Matthew Moore would never impose. The decision to poison him had formed slowly over the following days, as Grace recognized that individual revenge could serve larger purposes. Matthew Moore's death would disrupt the economic system that sustained Thornfield Ranch. It would create chaos that might provide opportunities for escape that normal circumstances would never allow. And it would demonstrate to other enslaved people throughout Robertson County that their oppressors were not invulnerable, that resistance was possible, and that justice could be claimed even by those whom the law refused to recognize as fully human. She had begun her research immediately, studying the plants that grew around the ranch house and asking careful questions of the elderly woman who maintained the herb garden and possessed knowledge about healing and harming that had been passed down through generations. The oleander had presented itself as the perfect weapon, common enough that its presence would attract no attention, deadly enough to guarantee results, and difficult enough to detect that doctors would likely attribute death to natural causes rather than murder. The night that transformed Grace from victim into avenger began like so many others at Thornfield Ranch, with the oppressive heat of a Texas summer evening that made sleep difficult and tempers short. Grace had finished her kitchen duties and was preparing to retire to her small room when she heard sounds coming from the direction of the smokehouse, a structure located behind the main house where meat was cured and stored away from the summer heat that could spoil provisions in a matter of hours. The sounds were wrong, a combination of muffled crying and male voices that carried undertones of violence barely restrained. Grace had moved toward the noise with growing dread, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized one of the voices as belonging to Eli Barrett, the overseer whose cruelty had made him feared throughout the plantation. But the other voice stopped her cold because it belonged to Matthew Moore himself, and the words he was speaking made her blood run cold with a fury so intense that her vision blurred. She had found them in the shadows behind the smokehouse, Matthew Moore gripping Hannah's arm while Barrett held a lantern that cast grotesque shadows against the wooden planks. Hannah's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wild with terror that no amount of previous suffering had prepared her to endure. The scene told a story that required no words, a tableau of power and violation that had been repeating itself throughout the history of American bondage with such regularity that many white people considered it an unremarkable feature of the system rather than a crime deserving punishment. Holdo, Akaway. Grace had frozen in place, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing while calculating the dangers of intervening versus the guilt of remaining silent. Matthew Moore's words drifted across the humid air, explaining to Barrett that the overseer could take his turn after Moore had finished, that sharing such privileges helped maintain loyalty among the white men who enforced the racial hierarchy that kept the entire system functioning. Hannah had seen Grace then, her eyes locking onto her sister's with an expression that communicated volumes without speaking a single word. The shame, the terror, the desperate hope that Grace might somehow rescue her from this nightmare, all flickered across Hannah's face in the space of a heartbeat. And Grace had realized in that moment that she faced a choice that would define the rest of her existence, however long or short that might prove to be. She could interrupt this assault, knowing that her interference would likely result in brutal punishment for both sisters and would not prevent Matthew Moore from simply waiting for another opportunity to continue his violations. She could remain silent, preserving her own safety while condemning Hannah to continued abuse that would destroy her sister's spirit, even if it left her body technically intact. Or she could appear to accept the situation while planning a response that would eliminate the threat permanently, regardless of the risks such action would create for her own survival. Grace had backed away slowly, returning to the main house with her mind already beginning to formulate plans that would take months to execute but would deliver justice that no other authority would provide. She had spent the rest of that night lying awake in her small room, staring at ceiling boards while her thoughts organized themselves into a framework for revenge that would be methodical, untraceable, and absolutely final. The following morning, Grace had found Hannah in the laundry room, her sister's hands mechanically scrubbing clothes while her eyes stared at nothing in particular. The conversation that followed had been brief because words felt inadequate to address what had happened, but Grace had made a promise that she intended to keep regardless of the consequences. She had taken Hannah's hands in her own and spoken with quiet intensity that left no doubt about her commitment. She had promised that Matthew Moore would pay for what he had done, that his death would come in a manner that appeared natural and beyond suspicion, and that Grace would not act rashly or emotionally but would plan with the cold calculation necessary to ensure success. Hannah had stared at her sister with a mixture of hope and terror, understanding that what Grace was proposing would likely lead to both of their deaths if discovered, but also recognizing that some violations demanded responses that transcended considerations of personal safety. Grace had begun her preparations that same day, starting with careful observation of the plants growing around the ranch house perimeter. She had noticed the oleander bushes years earlier, their pink and white blossoms providing ornamental beauty that Matthew Moore's late wife had cultivated with the same attention to aesthetics that had characterized her approach to making Thornfield Ranch appear civilized, despite the brutality that sustained its operations. The elderly woman who maintained the herb garden, a person named Cora Lawrence who possessed knowledge accumulated over 7 decades of survival in bondage, had provided essential information about the oleander's properties when Grace had asked seemingly innocent questions about which plants were dangerous to livestock. Cora had explained that every part of the oleander was toxic, that ingestion could cause heart failure that mimicked natural cardiac disease, and that the plant's deadly nature had claimed the lives of animals and occasionally humans who had consumed it accidentally or with deliberate intent. Grace had tested her extraction methods on chickens first, feeding them small amounts of oleander leaves mixed with grain and observing the results with clinical detachment that surprised her. The birds had died within hours, their bodies exhibiting the same cardiac symptoms that Cora had described. She had refined her technique over several weeks, learning how to dry and powder the leaves to maximize potency while minimizing the risk of detection through taste or smell. But the knowledge that she possessed the means to kill Matthew Moore had not immediately translated into action, because Grace understood that successful murder required not just method, but opportunity and motive that would deflect suspicion away from herself. She needed to wait for the perfect moment, a time when his death would seem natural and inevitable rather than suspicious and worthy of investigation. That moment had arrived when Matthew Moore's doctor had diagnosed him with cardiac irregularities during a routine examination 3 months earlier. The physician had warned that stress, rich food, and excessive drinking could trigger a fatal episode at any time, advice that Matthew Moore had cheerfully ignored while continuing to consume elaborate meals and expensive whiskey with the confidence of a man who believed his wealth could protect him from mortality itself. The diagnosis had provided perfect cover for what Grace was planning. When Matthew Moore died of apparent heart failure, doctors would attribute his death to the condition they had already identified, rather than looking for evidence of poisoning. The timing was ideal, the method was ready, and Grace's resolve had hardened into something that felt less like hatred and more like the cold determination of someone executing a military operation against an enemy who deserved no mercy. She had chosen Sunday supper for the poisoning, because the weekly ritual represented everything she despised about Matthew Moore's hypocrisy. He attended church services every Sunday morning, sitting in the front pew reserved for prominent families, singing hymns about Christian charity while planning the week's business activities that would extract maximum profit from the labor of people he refused to acknowledge as fully human. He returned home for elaborate midday meals that celebrated his prosperity and his position in the social hierarchy that governed Robertson County's Plantation society. Grace had prepared the fatal coffee that morning with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. She had ground the oleander leaves into fine powder, mixed them thoroughly with the coffee beans, and prepared the brew exactly as Matthew Moore preferred it, strong and dark with just enough sugar to offset the natural bitterness. She had poured his first cup while he carved the roasted quail, had refilled it twice during the meal, while maintaining the same expression of neutral competence that had characterized her service for 18 years. And now she watched him die, counting the seconds while her mind remained calm and focused on the performance that would need to continue long after his body grew cold on the dining room floor. This was not an ending but a beginning, the first move in a game that would test whether Grace Harris possessed not just the courage to commit murder, but the intelligence to escape punishment, and the vision to transform personal revenge into something larger and more dangerous than Matthew Moore's survivors could possibly imagine. The final preparations had begun 3 days before the fatal Sunday supper, when Grace Harris stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the kitchen garden, harvesting oleander leaves with the careful precision of someone whose life depended on leaving no evidence of her activities. The morning air carried the scent of wild sage and mesquite smoke from distant campfires, while overhead the stars blazed with an intensity that seemed to mock the smallness of human concerns beneath their ancient light. Grace worked quickly but methodically, selecting mature leaves from different plants to avoid creating obvious gaps in the ornamental bushes that might attract attention from anyone who bothered to inspect the ranch house perimeter. She had chosen the darkest phase of the moon for this harvest, understanding that even the most careful observer would struggle to identify her movements in conditions where shadows merged into absolute blackness. The overseer Eli Barrett would be sleeping off Saturday nights drinking at the cantina in Brazos Crossing, the small settlement 3 miles from Thornfield Ranch, where white men gathered to gamble and trade stories about managing their human property with maximum efficiency and minimum expense. The other house staff would not rise for another 2 hours, giving Grace the solitude necessary to complete her work without witnesses who might later recall suspicious activities. The oleander leaves went into a cloth bag that Grace had sewn specifically for this purpose, plain cotton fabric that could be burned after serving its deadly function. She had learned from her chicken experiments that approximately 40 mature leaves would be required to produce a lethal dose for a man of Matthew Moore's size and constitution. She harvested 60 leaves to ensure adequate potency, understanding that the drying process would reduce their weight and might slightly diminish their toxic concentration. Hoked. Back in the kitchen, Grace had spread the leaves across the warming shelf above the fireplace, a location that provided consistent low heat, perfect for drying plant material without destroying the cardiac glycosides that made oleander so effective as a poison. The process would require 48 hours of careful monitoring to ensure the leaves dried thoroughly without burning or developing the kind of obvious discoloration that might raise questions if anyone happened to notice them. She had hidden the drying leaves behind stacks of herbs that legitimately belonged in the kitchen, creating multiple layers of camouflage that would deflect casual observation. Rosemary, sage, and thyme provided aromatic cover that masked any scent the oleander might produce during the drying process. The positioning was perfect, visible enough that their presence wouldn't seem like an attempt at concealment, but ordinary enough that no one would think to examine them closely or question their purpose in a kitchen where dried plants were completely normal. The grinding came next, a process that required both time and careful attention to achieve the fine powder necessary for mixing with coffee grounds. Grace had waited until late Saturday evening, when the household had retired and she could work without fear of interruption. The mortar and pestle had been scrubbed clean before she began, ensuring no residual food particles would contaminate her poison or later provide evidence that could connect this kitchen tool to Matthew Moore's death. She had ground the dried leaves slowly, methodically, reducing them to a powder so fine it felt like silk against her fingertips. The texture was critical because coarse particles might be noticed in the coffee, triggering suspicion that could unravel everything she had planned. Grace had tested samples against her palm, feeling for any grittiness that might betray the presence of foreign material in a beverage that Matthew Moore consumed daily, and would immediately recognize if anything seemed abnormal. The powder had been transferred to a small tin that once held imported tea, a container she had saved specifically for this purpose because its size allowed for easy concealment, and its previous contents meant no one would question finding it in the kitchen. She had labeled it with a simple marking that indicated black pepper, a seasoning common enough that its presence would attract zero attention from anyone who might happen upon it while searching for cooking supplies. Sunday morning had arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made Texas summers feel like divine punishment inflicted on settlers who had presumed to claim this harsh land for their own purposes. Grace had risen earlier than usual, wanting extra time to ensure every detail of her plan proceeded exactly as intended. The other house staff, 2 women named Lily Daniels and Autumn Freeman who handled cleaning and laundry duties, had noticed nothing unusual about Grace's early start, because she frequently began meal preparations before dawn to accommodate the complex cooking required for Matthew Moore's elaborate Sunday dinners. The coffee preparation had been Grace's moment of greatest vulnerability because the timing needed to be perfect and the method needed to appear completely routine. She had ground fresh coffee beans as she did every morning, the familiar sound of the hand grinder providing comforting normalcy that masked the deadly addition she was about to make. The oleander powder had been mixed directly with the ground coffee, stirred thoroughly to ensure even distribution throughout the entire batch. Grace had used slightly more coffee than normal, calculating that the stronger brew would better mask any subtle flavor notes the poison might contribute. Matthew Moore preferred his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, a preference that worked perfectly for Grace's purposes, because the intense bitterness of over-extracted coffee would overwhelm any taste the oleander might add to the final beverage. The coffee pot had been prepared using the French press method that Matthew Moore had brought back from a business trip to New Orleans, a device that allowed for stronger extraction than traditional brewing techniques. Grace had heated water to just below boiling, poured it over the poisoned grounds, and allowed the mixture to steep for exactly 4 minutes before pressing the plunger down to separate liquid from solid material. The resulting brew was dark as midnight and aromatic enough to fill the kitchen with the kind of rich scent that made coffee one of the few genuine pleasures available in this brutal corner of Texas. She had poured the first cup into Matthew Moore's personal china service, a set decorated with blue pastoral scenes that seemed designed to remind him of the genteel civilization he imagined himself representing on this raw frontier. The cup had been placed on a silver tray alongside the sugar bowl and cream pitcher, ready to be carried into the dining hall when the meal service began. The Sunday supper itself had been prepared with the same meticulous attention that Grace applied to all her cooking, because any deviation from her normal standards might raise suspicions that could prove fatal if investigators later questioned the circumstances of Matthew Moore's death. The roasted quail had been seasoned perfectly, the sweet potato pie had achieved exactly the right balance of sweetness and spice, and the cornbread had emerged from the oven with a golden crust that would have won praise at any table in Robertson County. Grace had served the meal with the same neutral efficiency that characterized all her interactions with Matthew Moore, presenting each course at precisely the right moment, refilling his coffee cup whenever it fell below half full, and responding to his occasional comments with the minimal acknowledgement that he expected from his house staff. She had poured his second cup of poisoned coffee while he carved the quail, had delivered the third cup while he consumed his sweet potato pie, and had watched with carefully controlled expression as the oleander began its deadly work on his cardiovascular system. The symptoms had manifested gradually at first, subtle enough that Matthew Moore had attributed them to indigestion, or the heat that made Texas summers uncomfortable even for those wealthy enough to afford imported ice and ceiling fans. He had complained of feeling flushed, had loosened his collar, had reached for his water glass with hands that trembled slightly in ways he probably attributed to age, rather than poison coursing through his bloodstream. But the progression had accelerated quickly once the cardiac glycosides reached therapeutic concentration in his system. The flushing had given way to pallor, the slight tremor had become obvious shaking, and the mild discomfort had transformed into visible distress that made his breathing labored and his movements increasingly uncoordinated. Grace had watched each stage with the clinical detachment of someone observing a scientific experiment, rather than the death of a human being who had controlled her existence for 18 years. When Matthew Moore had finally reached for his water glass and sent it crashing to the floor, Grace had understood that the point of no return had been crossed. The oleander was now fully engaged in its deadly work, disrupting the electrical signals that regulated his heartbeat, and causing the kind of catastrophic cardiac failure that would appear identical to the natural progression of the heart disease his doctor had already diagnosed. Everything was proceeding exactly as Grace had planned, and now she needed to shift from poisoner to performer, playing the role of loyal servant shocked by her master's sudden medical emergency. She had called out for help with exactly the right tone of alarm, not so hysterical that it seemed performed, but urgent enough to bring the other house staff running from their various locations throughout the ranch house. Lily Daniels had arrived first, her eyes widening at the sight of Matthew Moore, convulsing on the dining room floor. Autumn Freeman had followed seconds later, her hands flying to her mouth in shock at witnessing the most powerful man in Robertson County, reduced to helpless thrashing. Grace had directed them with calm authority, sending Lily to fetch water and Autumn to summon the doctor from Brazos Crossing, creating activity that looked like desperate attempts to save Matthew Moore, while actually ensuring that no effective medical intervention would occur until the poison had completed its work. She had knelt beside his convulsing body, checking his pulse with fingers pressed against his throat, feeling the irregular rhythm that indicated his heart was failing exactly as the oleander's cardiac glycosides were designed to cause. The performance required balancing multiple concerns simultaneously because Grace needed to appear genuinely distressed while avoiding any actions that might actually preserve Matthew Moore's life. She had loosened his collar as if trying to help him breathe more easily, had elevated his head slightly as though preventing him from choking, and had spoken reassuring words that suggested she believed he would recover from this episode. Every action was calculated to demonstrate loyalty and competence while ensuring that the outcome remained exactly what Grace intended. Matthew Moore's final moments had been characterized by the kind of undignified suffering that seemed fitting for a man who had inflicted so much cruelty during his years of wielding absolute power over other human beings. His face had contorted with pain, his body had lost control of basic functions, and his eyes had reflected the terror of someone recognizing their own mortality approaching with unstoppable momentum. Grace had watched those eyes as the light faded from them, feeling no pity for the man whose death was delivering justice that no court of law would ever impose on behalf of enslaved people, whose humanity Texas refused to recognize. When his body had finally gone still, Grace had checked again for a pulse she knew would not be present, had closed his staring eyes with hands that remained perfectly steady, and had looked up at Lily and Autumn with an expression of tragic sorrow that concealed the satisfaction burning in her chest like vindication finally achieved. The execution phase of her plan was complete, and now the even more dangerous work of surviving the aftermath was about to begin. The sound of boots on the front porch came exactly 14 minutes after Matthew Moore's heart had stopped beating, earlier than Grace had anticipated and belonging to someone whose presence would complicate everything she had carefully planned. Joseph Taylor, the ranch foreman who managed the cotton operations and supervised the field workers, had returned from his weekly ride to inspect the property boundaries far sooner than his normal schedule should have allowed. His weathered face appeared in the dining hall doorway, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the scene of Matthew Moore's body on the floor, surrounded by the 3 house staff who had witnessed his final moments. Joseph Taylor occupied an unusual position in the hierarchy of Thornfield Ranch because he was a free black man, one of the few in Robertson County who had purchased his freedom years earlier and had built a reputation for competence in agricultural management that made him valuable enough for white plantation owners to overlook the uncomfortable reality of his legal status. Matthew Moore had hired him 5 years ago, after the previous foreman had stolen money and disappeared into Mexico, and Joseph had proven himself capable of managing complex operations while maintaining the kind of discipline among field workers that white overseers achieved through brutality. His presence at this moment represented a danger that Grace had not adequately considered in her planning. Joseph Taylor possessed intelligence and observational skills that exceeded those of most white men she had encountered, and his position outside the simple categories of enslaved or enslaver meant he might notice details that others would overlook. He was neither fully trusted by white society nor completely accepted by the enslaved community, existing in a liminal space that gave him perspectives unavailable to those whose positions were more clearly defined. Grace watched Joseph's eyes sweep the dining hall, taking in the shattered water glass, the half-consumed meal still on the table, the coffee service with its elegant china pot, and Matthew Moore's body positioned in ways that suggested he had fallen from his chair during some kind of medical emergency. Those eyes lingered on details that most people would miss, and Grace felt her heart rate accelerate as she recognized that Joseph Taylor was conducting an investigation rather than simply observing a tragic scene. "What happened here?" Joseph asked quietly, his voice carrying an edge that suggested the question was more than casual inquiry. He moved into the room with careful steps that avoided disturbing anything, his gaze continuing to scan surfaces and objects with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to notice when things were not quite right. Grace responded with the same story she had prepared for this moment, explaining how Matthew Moore had been enjoying his Sunday supper when he had suddenly complained of chest pains, how quickly the medical emergency had escalated, and how helpless she had felt watching him collapse, despite her desperate attempts to provide assistance. The words flowed smoothly because she had rehearsed them mentally for weeks, anticipating questions from doctors or law enforcement who might investigate the circumstances of a wealthy plantation owner's unexpected death. He obope. But Joseph's expression suggested he was hearing more than just the words Grace was speaking. He was evaluating her tone, her body language, the slight inconsistencies that might betray deception beneath the surface of her carefully constructed narrative. He knelt beside Matthew Moore's body, checking for signs of life that Grace knew he would not find, and then his attention shifted to the dining table, where the remnants of the fatal meal remained exactly as they had been when Moore's convulsions had interrupted his consumption. "He was drinking coffee?" Joseph asked, his hand moving toward the silver pot without quite touching it. The question seemed innocent enough, but Grace recognized it as a test, because the specificity suggested Joseph was following a line of reasoning that led toward conclusions she desperately needed to avoid. "Yes, sir," Grace replied, maintaining the deferential tone expected when enslaved people addressed free blacks who occupied supervisory positions. "He always has coffee with his Sunday supper. 3 cups, sometimes 4. Said it helped his digestion." Joseph nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the coffee service with an intensity that made Grace's stomach clench with anxiety. He was seeing something, noticing some detail that threatened to expose her carefully planned murder as exactly what it was, rather than the natural death from heart disease that she needed everyone to accept. The silence stretched uncomfortably, while Grace forced herself to remain calm, knowing that any sign of nervousness could trigger deeper suspicion. "Lily," Joseph said finally, turning to address the younger woman who stood near the doorway looking shocked and frightened. "Go fetch Doc Harrison from Brazos Crossing. Tell him Matthew Moore has died, and we need official confirmation for the death certificate. Autumn, you go inform Eli Barrett about what's happened. He'll need to secure the ranch and notify Moore's business partners in Houston." Both women departed quickly, grateful for the excuse to leave a dining hall that still smelled of death and carried the oppressive weight of tragedy. Their absence left Grace alone with Joseph Taylor and Matthew Moore's corpse, a situation that felt increasingly dangerous as Joseph continued his careful examination of the scene. "Grace," Joseph said quietly after the footsteps had faded down the hallway, "I need you to be completely honest with me about what happened here, because I'm seeing things that don't quite add up to the story you just told." The statement hit Grace like a physical blow because it confirmed her worst fear that someone with intelligence and observational skills had noticed inconsistencies she had hoped would remain invisible. She maintained her composed expression while her mind raced through possibilities for explanation or misdirection, calculating whether denial or partial confession offered better chances for survival. "I don't understand, sir," Grace replied carefully. "Master Moore had heart troubles. His doctor said he could have an attack at any time. That's what happened, isn't it?" Joseph studied her face with uncomfortable intensity before responding. "Maybe, but I've seen men die from heart attacks before, and something about this doesn't look quite right. The way his body is positioned, the color of his skin, the foam around his mouth. It reminds me of something else I saw years ago when livestock died, after eating poisonous plants." The air in the dining hall seemed to freeze as Joseph's words hung between them, an accusation not quite spoken but clearly implied. Grace felt terror surge through her nervous system while she fought to maintain control over her expression and her breathing. This was the moment she had dreaded, the possibility that someone would recognize the signs of poisoning, despite all her careful planning to make Matthew Moore's death appear natural. Before we continue with Grace's deadly gamble with fate, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. Hit that like button if you're ready to uncover the dark truth about resistance, revenge, and the price of justice in 1852 Texas. And make sure you subscribe, because this story is just beginning. Joseph moved closer to Grace, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper so that no one outside the dining hall could possibly overhear their conversation. "I know what he did to your sister Hannah. I've known for months. I've been trying to figure out how to address it without getting everyone on this ranch killed in the process. So if you did something to stop him, I need to know now before the doctor arrives and potentially notices the same things I'm seeing." The confession shocked Grace almost as much as Joseph's initial suspicion had terrified her. She stared at the foreman, trying to process the implications of what he had just revealed. Joseph Taylor had known about Hannah's assault, and had been planning some kind of intervention. His sympathy might represent salvation, or it might be a trap designed to elicit confession that would be used against her. Grace's survival depended on making the right choice in the next few seconds, about whether to trust this man or maintain her denials, regardless of what he claimed to know. "I don't know what you're talking about," Grace said finally, choosing caution over the risk of trusting someone whose motivations she could not fully understand. "Master Moore died of heart trouble, just like his doctor said might happen. That's all I know about it." Joseph held her gaze for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right. Then we're going to need to make sure that's exactly what the doctor's examination confirms, which means you and I need to work together very carefully over the next few hours to ensure nothing contradicts that story. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Grace understood perfectly. Joseph Taylor was offering to help her conceal Matthew Moore's murder, either because he believed the killing was justified, or because he recognized that investigations into a plantation owner's suspicious death would bring law enforcement scrutiny that could destroy everyone at Thornfield Ranch regardless of their guilt or innocence. His motivations might be protective, practical, or some combination of both, but the offer itself represented a lifeline that Grace had not expected and could not afford to refuse. "Yes, sir," Grace replied quietly. "I understand completely." The alliance that formed in those moments would transform Grace from an isolated murderer into part of a conspiracy that involved others who had their own reasons for wanting to see Matthew Moore's death accepted as natural rather than investigated as a crime. But Joseph Taylor's involvement also meant that Grace's secret was now shared with someone who possessed the power to either protect her or destroy her, depending on choices he would make in the dangerous hours ahead. The conspiracy that formed between Grace Harris and Joseph Taylor in the minutes following Matthew Moore's death required immediate action because Doc Harrison would arrive within the hour, and every detail of the scene needed to support the narrative of natural death from cardiac failure. Joseph moved with purposeful efficiency, his years of managing complex agricultural operations translating seamlessly into the orchestration of a cover-up that would either save Grace's life or condemn them both to execution if any element failed to withstand scrutiny. His first action was to remove the coffee service from the dining table, carrying the silver pot, cups, and saucers into the kitchen, with movements that appeared casual but were actually calculated to eliminate the most obvious source of evidence. Grace followed him, understanding without words that they were now operating as partners in a criminal conspiracy that bound their fates together regardless of whatever differences in status or freedom had previously separated them. "We need to dispose of this coffee," Joseph said quietly, pouring the remaining liquid down the drain while Grace watched the dark brew disappear into pipes that would carry it away from any possibility of chemical analysis. "Every drop needs to be gone, and the pot needs to be washed thoroughly enough that no residue remains. Can you handle that while I address other issues?" Grace nodded and began scrubbing the silver pot with the kind of vigorous attention normally reserved for removing stubborn food stains. She used lye soap and hot water, scouring the interior surface until it gleamed like new metal, eliminating any trace of the poisoned brew that had carried oleander extract into Matthew Moore's cardiovascular system. The cups received similar treatment, each piece of china scrubbed and rinsed multiple times to ensure absolute cleanliness. Joseph, meanwhile, returned to the dining hall and began adjusting Matthew Moore's body position to better match what would be expected from someone who had suffered catastrophic heart failure during a meal. He straightened the limbs that had been contorted by convulsions, arranged the clothing to suggest dignity rather than the loss of bodily control that had characterized Moore's final moments, and used a damp cloth to wipe away the foam that had accumulated around the dead man's mouth. "The foam is the biggest problem," Joseph explained when Grace returned from the kitchen. "Natural heart attacks don't usually produce that symptom, but certain types of poisoning do. We need an explanation that makes it seem consistent with cardiac failure rather than toxic ingestion." Grace's mind raced through possibilities while she stared at Matthew Moore's corpse, trying to think like a doctor who would be looking for natural explanations rather than evidence of murder. What if we say he was choking on his food when the heart attack hit? That would explain the foam and the distress, wouldn't it? Joseph considered the suggestion before nodding slowly. That could work. We'd need to make sure there's partially chewed food in his mouth to support the story. And we'd need everyone to remember him eating when the attack started, not drinking coffee. The revision of their narrative required careful coordination because Lily Daniels and Autumn Freeman had already witnessed the scene and formed their own memories of what had transpired. Joseph and Grace would need to gently reshape those memories through suggestion and repetition, planting details that would seem like recollection rather than fabrication, when Doc Harrison questioned the witnesses about Matthew Moore's final moments. Grace retrieved a small piece of cornbread from the kitchen and carefully placed it in Moore's mouth, positioning it to suggest he had been chewing when cardiac arrest had struck. The detail was gruesome but necessary, physical evidence that would corroborate the story they planned to tell about a man whose heart had failed while he was eating, rather than being poisoned by coffee laced with oleander extract. Joseph moved through the dining hall with systematic thoroughness, examining every surface and object to identify anything else that might contradict their narrative or suggest foul play. He studied the shattered water glass, the arrangement of furniture, the position of Moore's chair, looking for inconsistencies that a trained investigator might notice and question. His attention to detail revealed experience with covering up problematic situations, making Grace wonder what other secrets Joseph Taylor had helped conceal during his years at Thornfield Ranch. "The timing is crucial," Joseph said as he worked. "Doc Harrison needs to hear a consistent story from everyone about when the attack started, how long it lasted, and what symptoms Moore exhibited. Any contradictions will raise suspicions that we can't afford." They spent the next 20 minutes rehearsing the revised narrative, practicing the language they would use to describe Matthew Moore's death as a tragic but entirely natural event. The heart attack had struck while he was eating his Sunday supper, causing him to choke and collapse before anyone could render effective assistance. Grace had tried to clear his airway while Lily had fetched water, and Autumn had been sent to summon medical help. Despite their best efforts, Matthew Moore had died within minutes of the initial attack, his pre-existing heart condition making survival impossible, even with immediate intervention. The story was plausible, consistent with Moore's documented medical history, and designed to discourage the kind of detailed investigation that might reveal evidence of poisoning. Joseph made Grace repeat it multiple times until the words flowed naturally rather than sounding rehearsed, understanding that convincing performance required internalization rather than mere memorization. When Lily and Autumn returned to the ranch house ahead of Doc Harrison's arrival, Joseph and Grace were ready to begin reshaping their memories through careful questioning that planted suggestions while appearing to simply clarify the sequence of events. Joseph asked Lily to describe exactly what she had seen when she entered the dining hall, gently correcting details that contradicted the new narrative and reinforcing elements that supported it. "You saw him choking on his food, didn't you?" Joseph suggested. "That's why Grace was trying to help him breathe, because the heart attack hit while he was eating." Lily's face showed confusion as she tried to reconcile this version with her actual memories, but the authority in Joseph's voice and the seeming reasonableness of the explanation caused her to doubt her own recollections. "I think so," she said uncertainly. "Everything happened so fast, I'm not entirely sure what I saw first." "That's natural," Joseph assured her. "Traumatic events are hard to remember clearly. But you definitely saw Grace trying to help him breathe, right? That's the important detail that Doc Harrison will want to know." The manipulation was subtle but effective, exploiting the well-documented unreliability of human memory and the tendency for witnesses to unconsciously revise their recollections when presented with authoritative alternative versions. By the time Doc Harrison arrived, both Lily and Autumn had adopted the revised narrative as their own memories, genuinely believing they had witnessed Matthew Moore choke to death during a heart attack, rather than convulse from oleander poisoning. Doc Harrison was a weathered man in his 60s, who had practiced frontier medicine for 3 decades, and had seen enough death to recognize its various manifestations without requiring elaborate investigation. He arrived carrying a black leather medical bag that contained the limited tools available to physicians in rural Texas, prepared to conduct the kind of cursory examination that would satisfy legal requirements for issuing a death certificate. Joseph met him at the front door with appropriate solemnity, explaining that Matthew Moore had suffered what appeared to be a fatal heart attack during Sunday supper. The preliminary information was designed to frame Doc Harrison's expectations before he examined the body, predisposing him to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that supported the diagnosis of natural death. Not surprising given his condition, Doc Harrison said as he followed Joseph into the dining hall. "I warned him 3 months ago that his heart couldn't sustain his lifestyle much longer. Told him to reduce stress, avoid rich foods, cut back on the whiskey. But Matthew Moore never was one to accept limitations on his appetites." The doctor's comments provided perfect cover for Grace's crime because they established that medical professionals had already identified Matthew Moore as being at high risk for sudden cardiac death. Any ambiguous symptoms could be attributed to the progression of documented disease rather than raising suspicions about external causes. Doc Harrison's examination was thorough by frontier standards, but nowhere near comprehensive enough to detect subtle signs of poisoning that would have been obvious to more sophisticated medical examiners. He checked for a pulse that was obviously absent, noted the body temperature and the onset of rigor mortis, and observed the general appearance of the corpse without conducting the kind of detailed investigation that might have revealed chemical evidence. "Heart gave out just like I predicted it would," Doc Harrison announced after completing his examination. "Probably triggered by the exertion of eating and the stress of digestion. The choking incident that your staff described would have put additional strain on an already compromised organ. Death would have come quickly once the cardiac rhythm destabilized." Grace maintained her expression of appropriate grief while listening to Doc Harrison deliver the verdict that would officially transform her act of murder into a natural death requiring no further investigation. The relief that flooded through her system was so intense, she feared it might show on her face. But years of controlling her emotional displays in the presence of white authority helped her maintain the composed demeanor of a loyal servant, mourning her master's unexpected passing. "I'll prepare the death certificate citing cardiac failure as the primary cause," Doc Harrison continued, pulling papers from his medical bag and beginning to write in the cramped script of someone who had filled out hundreds of similar documents. "The county will need to be notified, and someone should send word to Moore's business associates in Houston. Does he have family that needs to be contacted?" Joseph provided information about Matthew Moore's brother in San Antonio and a sister in New Orleans, relatives who would need to be informed, but who lived far enough away that they wouldn't arrive for days or possibly weeks. The geographical distance provided additional protection for Grace, because by the time anyone with deep knowledge of Matthew Moore's habits and health arrived at Thornfield Ranch, the body would be buried, and physical evidence would have deteriorated beyond any possibility of revealing the true cause of death. Doc Harrison departed after providing instructions for preparing the body for burial and expressing condolences that sounded genuine, despite being delivered with the professional detachment of someone who witnessed death as a routine aspect of frontier life. His wagon had barely disappeared down the road toward Brazos Crossing when Joseph turned to Grace with an expression that mixed relief with ongoing concern. "We've cleared the first hurdle," he said quietly. "But now comes the harder part, which is making sure nothing emerges over the coming days or weeks that contradicts the story we've established. You need to dispose of any remaining evidence, and we need to ensure your sister Hannah doesn't say or do anything that might raise questions about motive." The reminder about Hannah sent a chill through Grace's chest because she had been so focused on executing the murder and surviving its immediate aftermath that she hadn't fully considered how her sister might react to news of Matthew Moore's death. Hannah knew what Grace had been planning, understood the revenge that motivated it, and might not possess the self-control necessary to conceal her satisfaction at their tormentor's demise. Hannah knew. The true test of Grace's deception came 36 hours after Matthew Moore's death, when his brother arrived from San Antonio, accompanied by a man whose presence transformed the atmosphere at Thornfield Ranch, from grieving household to criminal investigation scene. Andrew Harris was a former Texas Ranger who now worked as a private investigator specializing in suspicious deaths among wealthy landowners, and his sharp eyes and methodical questions made it immediately clear that he had been hired to determine whether Matthew Moore's sudden demise warranted deeper scrutiny than Doc Harrison's cursory examination had provided. Grace first became aware of the investigator's presence when she heard unfamiliar voices in the main parlor, a room that had been converted into a temporary memorial space where Matthew Moore's body lay in an expensive coffin awaiting burial in the family plot behind the ranch house. She had been working in the kitchen, preparing food for the steady stream of visitors who had been arriving to pay respects and offer condolences, when Lily had rushed in with urgent whispered information about the stranger, asking uncomfortable questions about the circumstances surrounding Moore's death. "He's questioning everyone," Lily said nervously, her hands twisting her apron into wrinkled fabric that betrayed her anxiety. "Wants to know exact details about what we saw, what Master Moore ate, how he was acting before the attack. He's not like Doc Harrison, Grace. This man is looking for something wrong." The news sent Grace's mind racing through calculations about how thoroughly she and Joseph had eliminated evidence and whether their cover story would withstand interrogation by someone trained to detect deception. She forced herself to remain calm, understanding that panic would only increase the chances of making mistakes that could expose her crime. She had survived 18 years of bondage by learning to control her reactions under pressure, and now that hard-won skill would be tested more severely than ever before. Andrew Harris was a tall man with iron-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades spent in harsh conditions pursuing dangerous work. He wore a long coat despite the Texas heat, and Grace noticed the telltale bulge that indicated he carried at least one pistol beneath the fabric. His eyes were pale blue and unnervingly direct, the kind of gaze that seemed to look past surface presentations to examine the truth hiding beneath carefully constructed facades. "You must be Grace," he said when she entered the parlor carrying a tray of coffee and refreshments for the visitors. "I understand you were the one who served Matthew Moore his final meal. I'd like to speak with you privately about what you observed that afternoon." The request was phrased politely, but carried the unmistakable weight of command, making it clear that refusing would only increase suspicion and intensify whatever investigation Harris was conducting. Grace set down her tray and followed the investigator into Matthew Moore's study, a masculine space filled with leather-bound books, hunting trophies, and the lingering scent of expensive cigars that would forever be associated with the man who had controlled her existence for 18 years. Harris closed the door and gestured for Grace to sit in one of the chairs facing the massive desk that had served as the command center for Moore's business operations. The positioning was deliberate, placing Grace in the subordinate position while Harris stood with his back to the window, his face shadowed in ways that made his expressions difficult to read, while the afternoon light illuminated Grace's features for his careful study. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them truthfully," Harris began, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of extracting confessions from people who initially had no intention of revealing their secrets. "Understand that I'm very good at detecting when people are lying to me, so attempting deception will only make this conversation more difficult for both of us." Grace nodded while forcing herself to maintain steady eye contact, knowing that avoiding his gaze would be interpreted as evidence of guilt. She had prepared for this moment during the hours since Matthew Moore's death, rehearsing her story until it felt like genuine memory rather than fabricated narrative. But the actual experience of being interrogated by a professional investigator was far more intimidating than her mental rehearsals had suggested. "Tell me about Matthew Moore's behavior during the meal," Harris said. "Did he seem ill, agitated, different in any way from his normal Sunday routine?" "No, sir," Grace replied, keeping her voice steady, and her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Master Moore seemed in good spirits. He was enjoying his supper, talking about his plans for the cotton harvest. Nothing seemed unusual until he suddenly started having trouble breathing." Harris nodded slowly, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "And what exactly did you serve him that afternoon?" Grace recited the menu with the kind of detailed precision that suggested genuine recollection rather than rehearsed response. The roasted quail, the sweet potato pie, the cornbread, the coffee. She described how she had prepared each dish, the timing of the courses, and Moore's reactions to the food. Every detail matched what she had told Doc Harrison and what the other witnesses had reported, creating a consistent narrative that should have deflected suspicion. But Harris wasn't finished. "The coffee," he said, his tone sharpening slightly. "Tell me specifically about the coffee. What kind did you use? How did you prepare it? How many cups did he drink?" The focus on the coffee sent alarm bells ringing through Grace's mind, because it suggested Harris suspected poisoning, despite the official cause of death being listed as cardiac failure. She maintained her composure while providing answers that were truthful in every detail except the crucial omission of the oleander powder she had mixed with the grounds. "Master Moore's favorite blend from New Orleans," Grace explained. "I prepared it the same way I do every Sunday, using the French press method he preferred. He drank 3 cups during the meal, same as always. Said it helped his digestion." Harris studied her face with uncomfortable intensity, looking for micro-expressions or nervous tells that might betray deception. Grace had learned during her years of bondage to control such involuntary reactions, understanding that survival often depended on concealing true feelings from white people who held power over her existence. That training served her well now as she returned Harris's gaze without flinching. "Did Matthew Moore have any enemies?" Harris asked, abruptly changing the direction of his questioning. "Anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" The question was a trap designed to elicit information about motive, and Grace understood that her answer needed to be carefully calibrated. Denying that Moore had enemies would seem implausible, given his position as a wealthy plantation owner in a region where conflicts over land, labor, and money frequently turned violent. But acknowledging specific antagonists might direct Harris's investigation toward individuals or circumstances that could eventually lead back to Grace herself. "Master Moore was a successful man," Grace said carefully. "I suppose success always creates some resentment among those who are less fortunate. But I'm just house staff, sir. I wouldn't know the details of his business dealings or personal conflicts." The answer positioned her as someone too peripheral to possess useful information about motive, while subtly suggesting that Harris should direct his inquiries toward Moore's white business associates rather than his enslaved household staff. It was a deflection technique that Grace had observed white people use countless times when questioned about matters they preferred not to discuss. Harris asked more questions over the next 30 minutes, probing for inconsistencies in Grace's timeline, contradictions between her account and those provided by other witnesses, or details that didn't align with his own observations of the death scene. But Grace had prepared too thoroughly, and Joseph had coached her too well for the investigator to find obvious gaps in her story. The interrogation finally concluded when Moore's brother interrupted to request Harris's assistance with some business documents that required review. Grace was dismissed with instructions to remain available for additional questioning if necessary, a reminder that Harris's investigation was ongoing despite his apparent inability to identify specific evidence of foul play. She returned to the kitchen with legs that trembled from released tension, finding Joseph waiting with an expression that showed he understood exactly what she had just endured. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "He suspects something," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The questions about the coffee were too specific to be routine. "He's looking for poison, even if he can't prove it yet." Joseph's face darkened with concern. "Then we need to make absolutely certain there's no physical evidence anywhere on this property that could support his suspicions. The tin container, any remaining oleander leaves, anything you used during preparation, all of it needs to disappear tonight." The urgency in his tone underscored the danger they still faced, despite successfully deceiving Doc Harrison and surviving Grace's interrogation. Andrew Harris represented a threat of a different magnitude because his professional training and investigative instincts made him far more likely to identify evidence that less experienced observers had missed. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing, and any mistake could now prove fatal. That night, after the household had retired, and the ranch lay quiet under a moonless sky, Grace and Joseph met in the kitchen garden to dispose of the final pieces of evidence that could connect her to Matthew Moore's murder. They worked in complete darkness, unwilling to risk even a small lantern that might attract attention from anyone who happened to be awake at this late hour. Grace had retrieved the tin container that had held the oleander powder, along with the cloth bag she had used to collect the original leaves and the mortar and pestle that had ground them into lethal dust. Joseph had brought a shovel, and together they walked to a remote corner of the property where abandoned equipment and refuse were left to rust and decay far from the main buildings. They buried everything 3 feet deep in soil that would eventually be plowed under when spring planting began, eliminating any possibility that the items could be discovered through casual observation or even moderately thorough search. The physical evidence of Grace's crime disappeared into Texas earth that had already absorbed so much blood and suffering during its violent transformation from wilderness to agricultural empire. "This is as safe as we can make it," Joseph said as they finished covering the hole and scattering dead leaves to disguise the recently disturbed soil. "But Harris is going to keep digging, metaphorically if not literally. We need to be prepared for him to find something we missed, or to pressure witnesses until someone's story cracks." Grace understood the warning and its implications. She had won the first battles in this war for survival, but the campaign was far from over, and defeat at any stage could still result in her execution and the exposure of everyone who had helped her conceal Matthew Moore's murder. The weeks following Matthew Moore's burial transformed Grace Harris from an individual seeking revenge into something far more dangerous and influential than she had ever imagined possible. The successful execution of her plan and the subsequent cover-up had demonstrated capabilities that caught the attention of people operating in shadows throughout Robertson County, individuals who had been watching Thornfield Ranch for years and waiting for the right person to emerge as a potential ally in a much larger campaign against the institution that had enslaved them all. The first contact came 3 weeks after the funeral, when Grace was working in the kitchen garden during the quiet hours of early morning. A woman appeared at the edge of the property line, emerging from the mesquite thickets that provided natural boundary markers between Thornfield Ranch and the uncultivated land beyond. She was perhaps 40 years old, her face weathered by sun and hardship, wearing the simple clothing of someone who worked fields rather than houses. But her eyes carried an intelligence and purpose that immediately set her apart from the defeated expressions Grace had seen on so many faces during her years of bondage. "My name is Faith Gilbert," the woman said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I work at Copper Creek Plantation, about 8 miles south of here. I've been sent to talk with you about what happened to Matthew Moore, and what it might mean for all of us." Grace's first instinct was suspicion, because unexpected visitors asking questions about Moore's death could easily be agents working for Andrew Harris or other authorities seeking evidence to support murder charges. But something in Faith's demeanor suggested genuine connection rather than entrapment, a shared understanding of suffering that created bonds invisible to those who had never experienced systematic oppression. "I don't know what you're talking about," Grace replied carefully, maintaining the defensive posture that had become second nature during weeks of heightened scrutiny. "Master Moore died of heart trouble, that's what the doctor said." Faith smiled slightly, a knowing expression that suggested she understood both Grace's caution and the truth hidden beneath official explanations. "Of course he did. Just like the overseer at Copper Creek died of snakebite last year, and the plantation owner in Brazos Crossing drowned in his own well 2 months ago. All very unfortunate accidents and natural causes that happen to eliminate men who made life unbearable for those under their control." The statement hung in the air between them, an admission of conspiracy that could destroy both women if repeated to the wrong audience. Grace stared at Faith, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing while calculating whether this conversation represented opportunity or trap. "There are more of us than you realize," Faith continued, her voice remaining low and controlled. "People who have decided that waiting for white society to recognize our humanity is a fool's hope. That justice delayed indefinitely is justice denied, and that sometimes the only way to stop monsters is to become something equally dangerous ourselves. We've been operating throughout this region for 3 years, removing the worst offenders and creating conditions that make resistance possible." Grace felt her worldview shifting, as Faith's words painted a picture of organized resistance far more sophisticated than the individual acts of defiance she had witnessed during her years at Thornfield Ranch. The network Faith described wasn't just helping people escape to northern states or conducting minor sabotage against plantation operations. They were systematically eliminating slave owners, overseers, and other enforcers whose brutality exceeded even the horrific norms of a system built on violence. "Why are you telling me this?" Grace asked, still uncertain whether she could trust this stranger who appeared from nowhere with revelations that could get them both killed if exposed. "Because you've proven yourself capable of the kind of action we need," Faith replied. Poisoning Matthew Moore required planning, courage, and the ability to maintain deception under intense pressure. Those are exactly the qualities we look for in people who might join our work. Joseph Taylor has been part of our network for 2 years. He's vouched for you, said you could be trusted with information that could destroy us all if it reached the wrong ears. The revelation about Joseph's involvement shocked Grace almost as much as Faith's description of the broader conspiracy. She had suspected Joseph sympathized with her revenge against Moore, but she hadn't realized he was part of an organized movement conducting what amounted to a covert war against the plantation system itself. The knowledge reframed everything she thought she understood about her position at Thornfield Ranch and the meaning of Moore's death. Faith spent the next hour explaining how the network operated, describing a structure that included enslaved people in trusted positions at multiple plantations, free blacks who owned businesses in nearby towns and could move freely without arousing suspicion, and even a few sympathetic whites who provided resources and information that made operations possible. They communicated through coded messages hidden in routine business correspondence, coordinated actions during church gatherings that authorities assumed were harmless religious observance, and maintained strict operational security that had kept them functioning despite the constant threat of discovery. Their methods varied depending on circumstances and targets. Some plantation owners died from poisoning, similar to what Grace had used against Matthew Moore. Others succumbed to accidents that were actually carefully staged murders, designed to appear like the unfortunate consequences of dangerous work in harsh environments. A few simply disappeared during business trips, their bodies never recovered from rivers or remote locations where they had supposedly encountered misfortune. But the network's activities extended beyond assassination. They assisted runaways by providing intelligence about patrol routes and safe houses along escape routes heading north. They sabotaged equipment and disrupted operations at plantations known for extreme cruelty. They spread information about brutal overseers and dishonest slave traders, helping enslaved people avoid the worst situations when sales separated families and scattered communities. "Your position at Thornfield Ranch makes you valuable," Faith explained. "Matthew Moore's death has created uncertainty about the property's future. His brother is considering selling the entire operation, which means dozens of families could be separated and scattered across Texas. We need someone inside who can gather intelligence about potential buyers, influence decisions about who gets sold where, and potentially prevent the worst outcomes for people who have no other protection." Grace listened to Faith's proposal with growing understanding that accepting this role would transform her from someone who had committed a single act of revenge into an active participant in an ongoing campaign that could continue for years. The personal satisfaction of killing Matthew Moore would be subsumed into a larger mission that required sacrifice, risk, and the kind of sustained commitment that could eventually cost her life. "What happens if I say no?" Grace asked, needing to understand whether this was truly an invitation or a demand disguised as choice. "Nothing," Faith replied simply. "We don't force anyone to join us. The work is too dangerous to include people who aren't fully committed. But I will say that you've already crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You've killed a white plantation owner and gotten away with it so far. That knowledge makes you dangerous to the system whether you choose to continue fighting or not. The only real question is whether you want to make your danger count for something larger than personal revenge." The logic was compelling, even if Grace resented being maneuvered into a position where refusing seemed like moral failure. She had indeed crossed a line that separated her from both the compliance expected of enslaved people and the individual resistance that characterized most opposition to the plantation system. Matthew Moore's death had made her a criminal in the eyes of the law, and a threat to the entire structure that sustained Robertson County's cotton economy. "I need time to think," Grace said finally, unwilling to make an immediate commitment to activities that could result in her execution if discovered. Faith nodded as if she had expected this response. "Take a week. Joseph will arrange another meeting where we can discuss specifics if you decide to join us. But understand that time is limited because Matthew Moore's estate will be settled soon, and once new ownership is established, your ability to influence outcomes will diminish significantly." The woman disappeared back into the mesquite thickets as quietly as she had arrived, leaving Grace alone with thoughts that churned through possibilities and dangers in equal measure. She had achieved her revenge against Matthew Moore, but Faith's visit suggested that individual justice was insufficient response to systematic oppression that affected thousands of people across Texas and the broader South. The transformation from victim to avenger was complete, but now Grace faced a choice about whether to evolve further into something that resembled a revolutionary fighting a war that most people refused to acknowledge was even happening. The decision would determine not just her own fate but potentially the survival of dozens of families whose futures hung in balance, as Thornfield Ranch's ownership transferred to new masters who might prove even worse than the man Grace had poisoned during Sunday supper. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.